Hi, welcome to day one of the MST expert training in culturally humble practice. We're going to be talking right now about complex racial trauma, about a racial trauma symptom scale, and post-traumatic growth. So I'm going to share the screen. And we're going to narrow our focus to the impacts on an individual experiencing racial trauma. So racial trauma is defined as a cumulative impact of race-based traumatic experiences at the individual, institutional, and systemic levels. It has significant effects on mental and physical health, as well as social and economic aspects of victims' lives. Racial trauma refers to experiences related to threats, prejudices, harm, shame, humiliation, and guilt associated with various types of racial discrimination. Experiences related to racial trauma can include microaggressions, inappropriate behaviors that encompass physical and verbal attacks, violence, death threats, and being beaten and witnessing racial murders. People can experience racial trauma either from being a direct victim or a witness. Complex trauma differs from trauma in its origin, the consistency of racial victimization beyond childhood, and the internalized racism associated with it. There is currently no way to identify racial trauma other than through a life course approach that captures the complex nature of individual, collective, historical, and intergenerational experiences of racism experienced by people of color in Western society. Complex racial trauma, or the COURT framework, provides experience portraying how racial trauma can be understood only through the complexities associated with the repetitive, constant, inevitable, and cumulative victimization of race-based stress. The major consequences of this trauma on the victim's life, and the major consequences of this trauma on the victim's lives. PTSD, as diagnosed in the DSM-5, neglects to reflect three fundamental aspects of racial trauma: its cumulative nature, the constant and inevitable concerns surrounding interpersonal, institutional, and systemic racism, and developmental hindrance. BIPOC individuals rarely identify with one single traumatic racial incident. Rather, they generally find themselves facing either a major racial trauma, such as witnessing someone killed by the police, or everyday racial trauma in the form of microaggressions. Research over the last 3 decades has shown that racial trauma causes depression and anxiety, and it also significantly and intrusively affects the life course of BIPOC people. It affects many facets of life, including attachments, interpersonal relationships, physical health, emotional responses, dissociative attitudes, general behaviors, cognitions, self-esteem, mental and physical health, and economic status. The race-based Traumatic Stress Symptoms Survey was created by Robert Carter and Carrie Muchow to evaluate the reactions of emotional and psychological stress associated with the experience of racial trauma and racism. You can see on the slide the different topics that are assessed. This tool may be implemented between the therapist and client or may be completed at home. This is not diagnostic per se, as there's not an official diagnosis of complex racial trauma, but does provide the clinician with information about the client's lived experience and the meaning they make of that experience. Following this, we'll talk about interventions. There are ideas in the literature that identify outcomes of trauma that are not solely negative. Both individuals and communities can increase resiliency, identity, and positive shifts that come from grappling with trauma. Systemic subjugation of a social group based on ethnicity or racial identity requires more than individual coping mechanisms to maintain wellness. While there is overlap between mass group level growth and collective resilience, there are also important differences. In 2021, Ortega-Williams et al. Wrote an article titled "An Integrated Historical Trauma and Post-Traumatic Growth Framework: A Cross-Cultural Exploration." This framework described a collective resilience and mass group level growth which both emphasizes self-help and leverages aggregate power to respond to social conditions. Both perspectives emphasize mutuality, solidarity, and loyalty beyond the boundaries of one's own immediate survival. But unlike a collective resistance, the post-traumatic growth framework contextualizes mass group-level growth in relationship to current encounters with systemic violence, historically traumatic events, and historical resistance, rather than just contemporary events. The concept of historical trauma is rooted in the cultural survival of a people at the mass group level, from colonization and present times. Post-traumatic growth reconceptualizes trauma recovery by focusing on the beneficial cognitive and personality shifts resulting from grappling with traumatic events. Post-traumatic growth consists of 5 domains of individual level functioning: relating to others, new possibilities, personal strength, spiritual change, and appreciation for life. Interventions designed to be culturally inclusive must explore a person's relationship with their mass group level identity. The expansion of assessment from a client's experience of trauma or multi-generational trauma existing within their particular families to collective harm could open a space for deeper healing. Thank you so much. I hope you have a great day.